Brian May is widely celebrated as one of the greatest guitarists in rock history. His layered guitar sound, emotional solos, and scientific approach to music helped define Queen's unique style. To the world, Queen looked like a perfect machine for talented men working in harmony, creating songs that filled stadiums and crossed generations. But behind that polished image was a quieter, more complicated reality. Like many long-lasting creative partnerships, Queen was built not only on friendship and talent, but also on tension, clashing personalities, and unspoken frustration. One of the least discussed, yet most important, relationships inside the band was between Brian May and bassist John Deacon. Their differences never exploded into public fights or dramatic breakups, but over time, those differences slowly created a deep emotional distance that changed the band forever. When Queen first formed in the early 1970s, Brian May was a young man driven by ideas. He was a trained physicist, deeply analytical and obsessed with perfection. He believed music should be carefully crafted, layered, and shaped until it reached its highest possible form. His homemade red special guitar became a symbol of this mindset, built with patience, precision, and vision. John Deacon, who joined the band in 1971, was almost a complete opposite. Quiet, shy, and practical, Deacon cared less about showmanship and more about stability. He believed that music worked best when it served the song, not the ego of the musician. While May chased grand musical statements, Deacon focused on simple, strong bass lines that held everything together. At first, these differences were a strength. Queen's early success came from the balance between complexity and simplicity. Songs like Killer Queen and You're My Best Friend showed how Deacon's subtle bass work could support May's rich guitar textures. However, as the band became more successful, the pressure increased. Albums needed to be bigger, tours more demanding, and expectations higher. In this environment, creative differences began to feel personal. Brian May often spent long hours in the studio, refining parts again and again. John Deacon, who preferred efficiency, sometimes felt these efforts were unnecessary. He rarely argued loudly, but silence can be just as powerful as shouting. Over time, that silence turned into quiet resentment. The key point is that this was never about hatred in a simple sense. There is little evidence that Brian May truly hated John Deacon as a person. Instead, the problem was emotional misunderstanding. May believed he was pushing the band toward greatness. Deacon often felt pushed aside, as if his contributions were being reshaped or overshadowed. Because Deacon disliked confrontation, many of these feelings stayed buried. Meanwhile, May, focused on the music, did not always notice the emotional cost of his leadership style. This kind of slow-building tension is common in long creative relationships, especially when one voice becomes louder than the others. As Queen moved into the late 1970s and early 1980s, these differences became harder to ignore. Deacon began writing more songs of his own, including Another One Bites the Dust, which became one of Queen's biggest hits. While the song's success proved Deacon's creative power, it also highlighted the growing gap between him and May's musical taste. May preferred Queen's dramatic, theatrical roots, while Deacon leaned toward rhythm, groove, and modern sounds. These were not wrong choices, just different ones. But without open communication, difference slowly turned into distance. This quiet rift did not destroy Queen overnight. In fact, the band continued to achieve massive success. But beneath the surface, something was changing. The friendship between May and Deacon was no longer growing. It was slowly freezing. Understanding this early stage is important, because it shows that Queen's later struggles were not sudden or shocking. They were the result of years of small moments, missed conversations, and emotional gaps that were never fully closed. As Queen entered the height of their fame, the band's internal dynamics became more strained, especially between Brian May and John Deacon. Success brought money, recognition, and global admiration, but it also brought pressure. Albums were no longer just artistic projects. They were massive business operations with deadlines, expectations, and millions of fans waiting. In this environment, Brian May's perfectionism intensified. He believed Queen had a responsibility to push boundaries and protect their musical identity. For him, every song needed to feel big, emotional, and timeless. This meant long studio hours, endless revisions, and layered arrangements that demanded patience from everyone involved. John Deacon experienced this pressure very differently. He was never comfortable with fame and did not enjoy the spotlight. While May thrived on interviews, performances, and creative control, Deacon preferred privacy and routine. To him, music was a craft, not a battlefield for dominance. When studio sessions stretched on for days because May wanted to perfect a single guitar part, Deacon often felt frustrated. From his point of view, the song already worked. The groove was solid, the structure was clear, and the emotional message was intact. Continuing to adjust it felt unnecessary and exhausting. These disagreements were not explosive, but they were constant. During the recording of albums like News of the World and Jazz, the contrast between May's epic style and Deacon's restrained approach became more noticeable. Songs such as We're the Champions and We Will Rock You reflected May's love for grandeur and drama, while Deacon's work leaned toward balance and subtlety. Instead of openly debating these differences, the two men often retreated into their own corners. May pushed forward with confidence, assuming his vision was best for the band. Deacon pulled back emotionally, choosing silence over confrontation. This silence is a crucial part of the story. John Deacon was known for being polite, calm, and conflict avoidant. He rarely challenged decisions directly, even when he disagreed. Over time, this created an imbalance. Brian May became one of the dominant creative voices in Queen, not because he demanded power, but because he was willing to speak up and push his ideas forward. Deacon, meanwhile, began to feel less like an equal partner and more like a supporting figure. This feeling was especially painful because his contributions were essential. Many of Queen's biggest hits relied heavily on his bass lines and songwriting instincts. The success of Another One Bites the Dust marked a turning point. The song became a worldwide hit and introduced Queen to a new audience. It proved that Deacon understood popular music deeply and could write songs that connected with millions. However, instead of bringing the band closer together, this success highlighted their differences. Brian May openly admitted that the song was not his favorite style. While he respected its success, he worried that Queen was drifting away from their theatrical identity. Deacon, on the other hand, likely felt validated by the song's impact, but also sensed that his creative direction was not fully embraced. As the 1980s progressed, these unresolved tensions followed the band into every project. Tours became longer and more demanding. Studio sessions became more isolated, with band members working separately instead of together. What once felt like a shared journey slowly turned into parallel paths. Brian May continued to lead with intensity and vision, while John Deacon became increasingly withdrawn. The problem was not that one man was right and the other wrong. The problem was that neither truly understood the emotional needs of the other. This stage of Queen's history shows how creative differences, when left unspoken, can slowly turn personal. Brian May believed he was protecting the band's legacy. John Deacon felt he was losing his place within it. Neither intention was harmful, but the result was a growing emotional gap. By the mid-1980s, that gap was no longer invisible. It was shaping the future of Queen, even if fans could not yet see it be why the mid-1980s. Queen had reached a level of fame few bands in history ever experienced. They were selling out massive stadiums, traveling constantly, and carrying the weight of being a global symbol of rock music. From the outside, everything looked triumphant. Inside the band, however, exhaustion was taking its toll. Years of non-stop work, creative pressure, and unresolved tension were beginning to reshape relationships, especially between Brian May and John Deacon. What had once been creative friction slowly turned into emotional distance, and that distance became harder to ignore. Touring played a major role in this shift. Queen's tours were intense, loud, and physically demanding. Brian May loved the stage. Performing energized him and gave him a sense of purpose. He connected deeply with audiences and believed that Queen's live shows were an extension of their artistic vision. John Deacon experienced touring very differently. He found it draining and overwhelming. Large crowds, constant travel, and public attention made him uncomfortable. After shows, while other band members socialized or celebrated, Deacon often retreated to his hotel room, seeking quiet and normalcy. This difference in lifestyle widened the gap between him and May, who embraced the rock star identity more openly. During this period, communication between the two men became minimal. They remained professional, but the warmth that once existed was fading. In the studio, they increasingly worked on their parts separately. Brian May would spend hours perfecting guitar layers, while Deacon focused on completing his bass work efficiently and moving on. This separation reduced conflict on the surface, but also removed opportunities for understanding. Without honest conversation, assumptions took the place of clarity. May assumed Deacon had lost interest. Deacon assumed May did not value his input. Emotionally, both men were struggling. Brian May faced personal challenges, including mental health struggles and difficulties in his private life. Music became his escape and his way of maintaining control. John Deacon, meanwhile, was becoming more focused on his family. He valued stability and privacy, and the chaos of Queen's world felt increasingly incompatible with the life he wanted. These emotional differences made it harder for them to support each other. Instead of bonding through shared hardship, they moved further apart. The recording process reflected this emotional state. Albums from this era showed signs of fragmentation. Instead of the band jamming together and shaping songs collectively, parts were often added individually. This method was efficient, but it lacked the emotional connection that had once defined Queen's music. For Deacon, this change reinforced a feeling that he was no longer an essential voice in the creative process. For May, it was a practical solution to keep the band moving forward despite internal strain. One of the most painful aspects of this period was the absence of open conflict. There were no dramatic arguments that forced issues into the open. Everything happened quietly. Resentment grew in silence. Misunderstandings went uncorrected. Over time, silence became the normal state of their relationship. This made reconciliation more difficult, because neither side fully understood how deep the other's feelings ran. Despite these struggles, Queen continued to perform at a high level. Fans saw polished shows and powerful music, unaware of the emotional cost behind the scenes. This contrast between public success and private strain added another layer of pressure. Brian May felt responsible for maintaining Queen's greatness. John Deacon felt trapped in a role that no longer fulfilled him. Both were loyal to the band, but loyalty alone was no longer enough to bridge the growing emotional divide. By the late 1980s, the relationship between May and Deacon had changed fundamentally. They were no longer close collaborators growing together. They were professionals moving in the same direction for the sake of the band. This shift set the stage for what would happen next when tragedy struck and forced each member Queen to confront what truly mattered to them. The late 1980s brought a shadow over Queen that changed everything. When Freddie Mercury was diagnosed with HIV, the band entered a period defined by fear, urgency, and unspoken grief. This tragedy should have brought Brian May and John Deacon closer together, but instead, it exposed how far apart they had already drifted. Each man responded to the situation in his own way, and those differences made their fragile relationship even more strained. Music, once a shared language, became another place where their emotional divide showed clearly. Brian May reacted to Freddie's illness by working harder than ever. He felt a deep responsibility to protect Queen's legacy and to honor Freddie's talent while there was still time. In the studio, May pushed for rich arrangements, layered guitars, and songs that felt meaningful and lasting. To him, this was a way of fighting back against loss. Creating something beautiful and complex felt like the only control he had in a situation that was otherwise heartbreaking. His intensity increased, and so did his need to shape the band's sound according to his vision. John Deacon responded very differently. Freddie's illness deeply affected him, but instead of pushing forward creatively, he pulled inward. Deacon had always been sensitive and private, and now the emotional weight became too heavy. He focused on his bass parts, did what was required, and avoided unnecessary involvement. Where May chased meaning through complexity, Deacon searched for stability through simplicity. He wanted to keep things functional and grounded, both musically and emotionally. This difference in coping styles created even more distance between them. During the recording of albums like The Miracle and Innuendo, the band rarely worked together in the same room. Ideas were sent back and forth. Parts were recorded separately, and the sense of unity that once defined Queen was largely gone. Brian May often reworked musical elements to achieve a fuller sound. For Deacon, this sometimes felt like erasure rather than collaboration. Even if May's intentions were artistic, the emotional impact on Deacon was painful. He felt less seen and less heard than ever before. What made this period especially damaging was a lack of honest conversation. Neither man openly expressed how they felt. May did not realize how deeply Deacon felt sidelined. Deacon did not fully explain how overwhelmed and disconnected he had become. Instead, both carried their feelings quietly, believing it was better not to add more stress during such a difficult time. Unfortunately, silence did not protect their relationship. It weakened it. When Freddie Mercury passed away in 1991, Queen lost its heart. For the world, it was the end of an era. For Brian May, it was a devastating personal loss that left him searching for purpose. For John Deacon, it was a final breaking point. Freddie had been the emotional glue that held the band together. Without him, Deacon no longer felt any reason to continue in an environment that had drained him for years. The unresolved tension with May now felt impossible to overcome. After Freddie's death, Deacon participated in a few tribute performances out of respect, but emotionally, he was already gone. The idea of continuing Queen without Freddie felt wrong to him. It was not just about grief. It was about survival. Walking away became the only way he could protect his mental health and his family life. Brian May, meanwhile, wanted to keep Queen's music alive. This difference in vision made reconciliation even less likely. This moment marked a point of no return. The quiet rift between Brian May and John Deacon, built over decades of unspoken frustration, could no longer be ignored or repaired. Tragedy did not create their divide, but it revealed it fully. From this point forward, Queen would never be the same, and neither would the relationship between its two most contrasting members. After Freddie Mercury's death, Queen stood at a crossroads. For Brian May, continuing the band felt like a way to honor Freddie's memory and keep the music alive. For John Deacon, the opposite felt true. Without Freddie, Queen no longer represented unity or purpose. It reminded him of years of emotional strain, creative frustration, and a lifestyle he never truly wanted. Quietly and without drama, Deacon began to step away. There were no press conferences or angry statements. His exit was slow, respectful, and deeply personal, reflecting the same reserved nature that had defined his role in the band from the beginning. Deacon's withdrawal was often misunderstood by fans. Many assumed he was simply overwhelmed by grief, but the truth was more complex. Grief was certainly part of it, but so was long-term exhaustion. Years of feeling emotionally disconnected from the band, particularly from Brian May, had worn him down. Deacon had given Queen some of his most memorable songs, yet he often felt invisible. Leaving was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of self-preservation. He chose peace over applause, privacy over legacy, and family over fame. Brian May struggled deeply with Deacon's decision. He respected it, but it hurt. For May, Queen was not just a band. It was his life's work. Seeing one of its core members walk away forced him to reflect on his own behavior. Over time, May began to speak more openly about regret. In later interviews, he acknowledged that his drive for perfection may have overshadowed the quieter voices in the band. He did not accuse himself of malice, but he recognized the emotional cost of his intensity. This kind of reflection did not come easily. It was shaped by loss, maturity, and distance. The silence between May and Deacon after the breakup spoke louder than any argument. They did not publicly attack each other. They did not rewrite history. Instead, they allowed their shared past to exist without constant explanation. Deacon refused to participate in new Queen projects, even when May and Roger Taylor continued performing with new collaborators. This was not bitterness. It was closure. Deacon had said everything he needed to say through his actions. Over time, the public narrative began to shift. Fans and historians started to understand that Queen's story was not just about glory and triumph. It was also about human limits. Brian May and John Deacon were not enemies. They were two very different people who created something extraordinary together, then slowly grew apart. Their relationship shows that creative success does not guarantee emotional harmony. Sometimes, the very qualities that make collaboration powerful also make it painful. Today, John Deacon lives a quiet life away from the spotlight. He does not give interviews, attend tours, or comment on Queen's legacy. Brian May continues to perform, speak, and celebrate the band's history, often acknowledging Deacon's importance. In moments of honesty, May has admitted that he wishes things had been different between them. These reflections are not attempts to change the past. They are acknowledgments of it. The story of Brian May and John Deacon is not one of hatred or betrayal. It is a story of silence, misunderstanding, and emotional distance. It reminds us that even the greatest bands are made of human beings, each with their own fears, needs, and limits. Queen's music endures because of the balance these men once shared. But their relationship ended because that balance was never fully protected. In that quiet ending lies a true lesson of their story. Looking back at Queen's history, it becomes clear that the story of Brian May and John Deacon is not just about one band, but about the larger price of greatness. Queen achieved what few artists ever do: global fame, timeless music, and a legacy that continues decades later. Yet behind that success was a constant emotional cost, paid quietly by the people who created it. The relationship between May and Deacon shows how creative brilliance can exist alongside deep personal strain, and how success does not always leave room for emotional care. Brian May's role in Queen is often described as visionary. He pushed boundaries, challenged limits, and refused to settle for mediocrity. Without his ambition, Queen might never have developed its signature sound. Songs like Bohemian Rhapsody and Brighton Rock required an obsessive level of detail that only someone like May would attempt. However, vision can easily turn into dominance when not balanced by empathy. Over time, May's strong presence unintentionally shaped the band's environment in ways that made quieter members feel overlooked. This was not cruelty, but was impact without awareness, and impact matters as much as intent. John Deacon represents the other side of creativity. He was grounded, practical, and deeply musical in a way that did not seek attention. His bass lines were not designed to impress, but to support. Ironically, this strength made him easy to underestimate. In a band filled with bold personalities, Deacon's calm nature allowed louder voices to take the lead. As Queen grew larger and more chaotic, there was less space for his quieter approach. The more he felt overshadowed, the more he withdrew, creating a cycle that was hard to break. What makes this story especially powerful is the absence of villains. There is no single moment where everything went wrong, no explosive argument that destroyed the friendship. Instead, the damage happened slowly. It happened through small choices, misconversations, and emotional fatigue. This is often how real relationships end, not with drama, but with distance. May and Deacon continued to respect each other professionally, but respect alone was not enough to maintain emotional connection. Queen's legacy today is shaped by both what was created and what was lost. The music stands as proof of what happens when very different minds come together. At the same time, Deacon's departure serves as a reminder that creative environments must care for people, not just results. When personal needs are ignored for too long, even the most successful partnerships can break. Deacon did not walk away because he failed. He walked away because staying would cost him more than leaving. For fans, this story changes how Queen's music is heard. Songs once seen only as anthems now carry deeper meaning. They reflect not just joy and power, but tension, compromise, and emotional effort. Understanding the relationship between May and Deacon adds a human layer to the music. It reminds listeners that behind every great song are real people navigating complex emotions. In the end, the story of Brian May and John Deacon is not about blame. It is about awareness. It teaches that talent must be matched with communication, and ambition must be balanced with empathy. Queen became legendary.